G'day, CU. It's great to be with you as we travel through the book of Ecclesiastes with a teacher, thinking through what can be gained from life lived under the sun. He's assessing what is it worth investing our time and energy into. He's weighing up a whole bunch of different options and is thinking about a whole bunch of different aspects of life as we pursue gain and meaning under the sun. And tonight in chapter 4, he turns to hostile relationships. Relationships which are hostile to human flourishing and us achieving what we're seeking to gain. When I was in high school, I can think of a few people who pursued their dreams and succeeded. There's one guy called Fuzz who wanted to be a professional triathlete. He started training in year 11, he studied sports science, and then he went on to have a 10-year career as a triathlete traveling around the world. He never got to any amazing lofty heights, but he had a great time, and I think he would say it was all worthwhile. He pursued his dream and worked hard. Another friend of mine wanted to become a professional golfer. We were discussing one time where we'd be in 5 years, and he said that in 5 years' time he hoped to be playing in the Australian Open of golf. And sure enough, around about that time he was. And to this day, he's a professional golfer. And I would say that I would think he has a very satisfying career path. A guy I knew when I was studying in Sydney. In fact, I used to disciple him. We'd do one-to-one discipleship. I'd read the Bible with him each week and pray with him. That guy wanted to become a Hollywood actor. So after year 12, he went off and did some courses and did a bit of acting here in Australia, then moved over to LA. And he's got this flourishing acting career now. He's made it. He played Lucifer in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which I think is fantastic. I discipled a guy to being the best Lucifer he could be. I'm pretty proud of that achievement. Here in this passage in chapter 4, the teacher is observing that, against that wisdom, which is one of those mission statements that we often bandy around in the West, that mission statement that work hard, pursue your dreams, and you can achieve anything you want to. Against that mission statement, the teacher is saying, yes, but what about all these dysfunctional relationships or dysfunctional relationship dynamics that are a hurdle to that or work against that kind of view of life? And the first hostile relationship that he raises is that of the oppressor in chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors. They have no comforter. He emphasizes it by repeating it. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. So what he's saying here is that some people are so cruelly oppressed that they would have been better off if they were never born. And there are some people who are happier now because it's an escape from the cruelty of oppressors. In this past few weeks, we've seen, haven't we, the horror and the terror of evil oppressors in Afghanistan as the Taliban has taken over. There was that story of that young man, the 19-year-old, who was a representative soccer player who had his whole life ahead of him. And he scrambled onto that plane and he was crushed by the wheel as it folded up into the wheel housing. That was the end of his life in such a cruel, tragic way. And there are many stories like that right now in Afghanistan. And this isn't just isolated to that area, is it? We know that there are lots of human rights violations or stories of them coming out of China. There's North Korea, where people are living long-term under this cruel dictatorship. Generations of people there are malnourished. There are wars constantly happening in Africa. Wherever you turn, there are the favelas in South America. There are just so many spots and different stories of injustice and oppression that we can see all around us. And the teacher is saying this is a major stumbling block to us even pursuing a life which we think might bring us gain. Secondly, he turns to the relational dynamic of envy and how big it is. Look there in verse 4. And I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Hebel. It's so cruel, isn't it, being driven by envy? We want to be loved. We want to be respected. We want to feel good about ourselves. And so the way that we do it is not just by having enough and enjoying our friendships. No, what we do is we pursue more and more so that our Instagram feed is more impressive than our peers. So our car is more luxurious than our neighbours. So our job title sounds more powerful than our friends. We pursue these things so that people will look up to us and so we feel good about ourselves. Now, what we want is just to be loved. That's the first thing. And number two, no one's really half as impressed as we think they are. It's a cruel thing being driven by envy. There's that great observation from Fight Club. We buy all this stuff that we don't really want with money that we don't have to impress people that we don't even like. That's a relationship dynamic that is hostile to us really gaining anything substantial out of life. Thirdly, he goes on to loneliness, a crippling relational dynamic. Verse 8 onwards. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business, says the teacher. So the teacher here is picturing a man who is working really hard to gain something out of life. And because he's been so focused on working hard, he hasn't invested in relationships. He's got no family, he's got no close friends. And at some point, in a moment of reflection, he stands back and he goes, what am I doing? I've worked so hard, but for whom? And I haven't enjoyed myself along the way particularly. It's all such a vain pursuit. And we hear of these stories all the time, don't we? Even people who have family and close friends can end up alienating their own families and becoming distant from their friends as they work hard to pursue and achieve. It's another relational dynamic that is hostile to us actually gaining anything significant or meaningful out of life. And finally, he goes on to the fickleness of public opinion or support. In the final case there in verses 13 through to verse 16, the teacher pictures a man who is young and who is on the wrong side of the tracks, either in prison or poor, in a situation where there's a king, but who's older, become a bit crusty, isn't listening to advice anymore. And the teacher's saying you're better off being that young man who's wise and willing to listen to advice rather than the king who isn't. And the teacher observes this young man rising up through the ranks because he's wise to a point where he is king. He is the successor. But then he also pictures a later generation of people who weren't there to see the rise of that young man, who didn't make him king, who now are not so enamored, who have turned against him, who haven't seen where he came from and are not that impressed by him, and they want something different, something new. Public opinion, public adoration, so fickle, isn't it? And so here, as I've said, there are four relational dynamics, relationships that the teacher is saying is hostile to whatever we think might be gained from life. Well, as always, we want to ask the question, so what? What does this mean for us? Well, the teacher is always quick to point out what is relatively speaking good, what is relatively speaking worth pursuing. I mean, he makes it very clear here that he's pretty down on life. 4 times in this passage, he says everything is hebel, mist, vapor, insubstantial, meaningless. He says that 4 times here in this passage, and yet at the same time, he elevates the value of friendships. Look there in verses 9 through to verse 12. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So here is something which the teacher identifies as worth investing in. Friendships, close relationships. Because there are many ways in which relationships can be hostile towards us and can be really unfair and brutal at times. But if you've got close friends, you can weather almost anything. Invest in friendships because they're the people who actually grow to love you and who you grow to love properly and fully in a way that's genuinely rewarding. Do this, pursue this, says the teacher. He lifts that up. But secondly, and more importantly, right through the book, the teacher keeps on coming back to this idea that it's all meaningless, it's all hebel because of the hostility of relationships. What we invest so much time and energy into doesn't finally deliver. Back to where I started, this idea that we work hard and pursue our dreams and we can achieve anything. I want to say, and I think the teacher would agree, and I think he does agree here in Ecclesiastes, that's not a bad path to take in life at all. It's much better to do that than to be lazy or to fail or to just do something out of obligation or duty. That's a much better path. It's not a bad idea. Go for it. But what the teacher is wanting to say is, because there are so many things which stand against it, if that's what we're made for as humans living life under the sun, something isn't working. He wants to say to us, dig deeper. Sure, pursue that path if you have the opportunity, but mind you, it is a bit of a Western indulgence to be able to even talk like that. You know, there are some parts of the world where they don't even have the starting opportunity to pursue their dreams. And so the teacher is saying, hang on a second, is that what life is meant to be about for all people? If it is, it's not working. What's going on here? Dig deeper. It doesn't finally deliver, is what he says, because of the hostility of human relationships. And of course, as people who are in Christ, this book keeps on pushing us back to our identity in Christ and the substance that we find in Christ. He says in a few parts of Ecclesiastes, the final conclusion is to fear God and obey him and trust him, because this life is confusing and it's full of things which thwart these pathways that feel like they're going to deliver us gain. And so therefore, thrust ourselves upon Christ as Lord. He knows what is going on. That is where we can find proper eternal gain. Amen.